Gotta do something.
The most expensive midterm election in history is coming to a close at a tune of $4 billion. And we're here in the Los Angeles Times newsroom to try to tell you what's been going on with it. I'm Kathleen Decker, the national politics editor, joined here by political writers Maeve Reston and Mark Baraback. We'll be covering Tuesday's elections from here, and we'll be with you again on Wednesday. Mark, just to start off, as far as the Senate goes, Republicans have to gain 6 seats. They've got a lock on 3. Tell us what's happening with the other races going on.
Well, like I said, I mean, there's no certainty, but it looks pretty close to certain Republicans are going to win Montana. They're going to win West Virginia and
South Dakota.
Thank you. I blanked on the third, South Dakota. So they're halfway there. They're halfway to the 6, and then what they need to do is pick up a few seats that have been in states that voted for President Obama. I mean, this whole year basically is being played on Democratic turf. Republicans have been on the offensive the whole year. The fact that most of the competitive states are in states that President Obama lost in 2012 helps them. The fact that it's a midterm election, historically, the party out of the White House picks up seats. So all year long, it's basically been an effort by Democrats to stave off defeat.
And make it about local races. I mean, Mark and I were just both in Colorado and then in Iowa, and what you hear from voters in all of these contested states almost immediately is disappointment with President Obama, who's been a huge drag on the Democratic candidates. He hasn't campaigned anywhere in the South. And, we're all just kind of waiting to see how much of a drag tomorrow night. But we could have lots of really fun outcomes, potentially with Joe Biden as the late outcomes and Joe Biden as tiebreaker, or, Greg Orman in Kansas as tiebreaker. It could be really, really fun.
What's been the prevailing, you've been out talking to voters in many states, as you mentioned. What's been the prevailing sort of emotion? Is it disappointment? Is it anger? Is it, get these guys, all of them, out of Washington?
I think it's frustration. And what I really felt in Iowa over the last week, which of course is a state that is increasingly blue, that Obama won twice, and he has one of the best ground games in the country. His organization did in that state. But doing lots of interviews all over the state in parking lots with voters, there's just this frustration with both sides, with the gridlock, with feeling disappointment in Obama and his policies. And what was most interesting is I expected to go there and have lots of conversations about Ebola and ISIS, but people were really feeling still that it's about the economy, even all this time after the crash. And just feeling this constant unease and anxiety that, all of the gains might be lost immediately. And then having that worry about things going awry across the rest of the world as just sort of this undertone to everything.
And to go back to something you asked, what Maeve just said, I mean, the fact is, at least empirically, if you look at statistics, the economy is better. It's way better than it was when President Obama took office, but people don't feel it. And that's fundamentally what it comes down to. I mean, like Maeve said, people are concerned about the economy, and notwithstanding the fact that it has gotten better and it is getting better and continues to get better, people personally don't feel it, they don't believe it, and that's the problem.
And they also didn't feel it in 2012, but President Obama was able to win re-election fairly handily, which goes to the difference between the electorate in a presidential year and a midterm. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, it's basically a classic formulation, a referendum versus a choice. In 2012, it was Mitt Romney versus Barack Obama. People might not have liked Barack Obama that much. Some obviously did. Some people didn't, but they liked him better than Mitt Romney. In this case, this is much more of a classic sort of referendum on the president. It's kind of like, do you like him or do you don't like it? And that's translating into gains, as we suggest, for the Republicans. And it's not unusual. This typically happens.
And the electorate generally is more conservative, whiter in midterm races. It's not as diverse as it would be in a presidential year. But the big difference that you are seeing this year is that Republicans are paying a lot more attention to their ground game, using data analytics, trying to catch up basically with what the Democrats did in 2012. And everybody can brag about their data before the fact, but we're really going to know tomorrow night whether or not they were able to pull out the vote. They've got some early signs of good news for Republicans. They were doing better in the early vote in states like Iowa and Colorado than they have in years past, but that obviously can be very deceptive because you don't know exactly where the ballots are coming from, and Republicans tend to do better on election day. So we'll have to see how that shakes out.
And a lot of the get out the vote effort has been done not by the party per se or the candidate per se, but these outside groups that have come
Right.
in with hundreds of millions of dollars this year to finance on both sides. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, one of the biggest ones, obviously, is Americans for Prosperity, which is part of the Koch brothers network. As we don't know exactly what they've spent so far, but in 2012 they spent most of their money on ads. This time they say that they're spending almost half of their money on the ground game. And I went out with them in Colorado, Americans for Prosperity, and it was really just, it's a totally data-driven effort like the Democrats and the Republicans this year. They're working off of iPads. They know exactly which voters they're targeting, and they say that it's a much more scientific effort, and it's kind of an experiment for them for 2016. But, in states like Colorado, they will be helping the Republican Party, even though they're not technically coordinating.
And something else I think is noteworthy too, notwithstanding everything we've said about how it's a bad year for Democrats, both in terms of the history, the math, the map. The fact is, even though I think we'd agree it's more likely than not Republicans will take control of the Senate, the fact that it is still uncertain does speak to the fact that, people aren't happy with Democrats. They don't like President Obama, but you know what? They like the Republicans even less.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it's just been some candidates that have been strong in certain states, but you certainly don't feel, that people are content with Republican leadership
or
in the
that
House.
they love the candidates that they have to choose between.
Well, that's another truism too. Campaigns matter, candidates matter. We saw that in Iowa. That was a state where when you started out, at least on paper, it was going to be a Democratic. It was going to be a layup for Democrats. It was going to be really easy. Joni Ernst, whether you agree with her policies or not, has been a very, very good candidate. And that's why she's in the position she is today. So
and
again,
the Democrat has proved that you don't insult farmers in Iowa as your opening gambit.
There you go. There you go. So again, candidates matter, campaigns matter.
Has anybody ever managed to sort of thwart the 6-year massacre?
Yeah, actually, Bill Clinton in 1998. Democrats picked up a handful of seats that year, which, as you said, contravened history. I mean, unusual circumstance. You had a president who was being impeached. You had Republicans who were seen at the time as very, very badly overreaching.
Under Newt Gingrich.
Under Newt Gingrich. So that's an exception. You asked about 6 years. There was another exception. I mean, people always say, usually without exception, the party out of power picks up seats. The exceptions, which we talked about in 98, and then 2002, I realized that was only the first midterm under Bush, but that followed 9/11. So again, two really extraordinary circumstances: an impeachment, 9/11. That's kind of what it takes to knock the historic norm off kilter.
Maeve, there's been a lot of action on the part of potential 2016 candidates going out in a lot of these key states. We've seen Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren, Rand Paul, Chris Christie. What sort of impact have they made in this?
Well, Chris Christie, for example, has made a huge impact because he's ended up raising a lot of money for his party as the head of the Republican Governors Association. Hillary Clinton was a little late to the game this time. Elizabeth Warren was out there a lot more than Hillary was, but she's really come on strong at the end, campaigning all over the country. And of course, Bill Clinton, who we've been talking about, is really the most popular surrogate the Democrats have on the campaign trail. Both of them have been in Iowa, Kentucky, and what's most interesting during this time is that it's sort of a time for the 2016 candidates to kind of tweak their message, test it. You hear Hillary Clinton talking about taking on big banks, which has really been a message much more associated with Elizabeth Warren. Chris Christie has been out there enough that he's sort of starting to try to recover from Bridgegate. And so it's just been sort of a preview of what things will look like. And Rand Paul, of course, has been all over the country as well.
And they're all essentially collecting chits for
Yes.
when and if they decide to run.
Right. I mean, Mitt Romney did a great job with this back in 2006. He was out there fundraising for, county sheriffs and local offices, and it really helped him build up goodwill within the party. So it'll be interesting to watch whether Hillary came on, early enough to build up that kind of goodwill within the party.
Mark, you've talked about how the Republicans are on the ascent in the Senate and Democrats are playing defense. How's it playing out in governors and legislative races? There's a different dynamic afoot in some areas?
Yeah, it's different in particular in governor's race. I mean, it looks like Republicans are going to make gains in some of the state houses, but this sort of contravenes this notion of a wave election, which a wave election tends to just sweep over or sweep in one party and out the other. And this looks to be, again, everything predicated on we don't know what's going to happen, but it looks very, very different because while Republicans are, as we suggested, certain to pick up seats, whether it's 3, whether it's 8, whether it's 4, we don't know. in the Senate. But you have this pattern across the country where there's a lot of Republican governors in very, very red states who are in trouble. Sam Brownback is probably, forgive the cliche, your poster boy this year. I mean, Kansas doesn't get, it's about as ruby red as Dorothy's slippers, right? Well, he's in big, big trouble. They're fighting to protect him there. You have a governor in Georgia who's in a lot of trouble. So what we're seeing in gubernatorial races is really sort of this anti-incumbent wave that is out there. So, if there's any kind of wave out there, it is less a Republican wave, certainly not a Democratic wave. It is an anti-incumbent. We're ticked off at these guys, and it seems to be the governors who are the ones who are bearing the brunt of it. And in blue states as well, Maryland, Massachusetts, states that are very, very blue, that you very likely have the prospect of Republican governors next year.
And oddly, the three biggest states are the ones that have avoided a lot of this entirely. You have,
right,
the Cuomo race for governor in New York, Brown in California,
and Texas is right.
Republican candidate in Texas likely to win.
We should say something about Texas because it was such a big deal. I mean, Democrats were doing cartwheels down Congress Street when Wendy Davis decided that she was going to run, right, of the famous filibuster, and she has turned out to be how do I put this? Just a terrible candidate. I shouldn't say not a terrible candidate. She really, I think it was putting too much on her shoulders, just as here in California, it's asking too much of Neil Kashkari, the Republican. To turn around a state like Texas, to turn around a state like California is a monumental undertaking. And it was just way too much hype, frankly, to suggest that Wendy Davis was going to do it all in one fell swoop.
Mm-hmm. Maybe you've indicated Iowa and New Hampshire are some of the states that we've had a lot of action in this year. Is there anything about how the electorate is reacting there that tells us what might be important to them in 2016 as the presidential contest moves to there?
Well, I mean, it's a fascinating question. And what's been interesting, it's interesting that New Hampshire is as close as it is. That's the Scott Brown, Jeanne Shaheen race, although I don't know that all of us think that it's quite as close as the polls are suggesting. But there you have Jeanne Shaheen really trying to run as an independent. There's a lot of voters there that are worried about immigration. So she's had to gravitate a little bit more. She is a centrist, but she's had to gravitate even more toward the center on issues like that, on immigration. And in Iowa, I mean, it's just amazing that we're still talking about the economy this further along after all of that went down. And I think that, voters are just really sour right now about the direction of the country. They don't have confidence in government. And that's going to be a big hurdle for all of the potential candidates as they run in 2016.
What occurred to me, what's interesting too is, the economy has actually been pretty good in places like Iowa. You have states where Georgia, the worst unemployment rate in the country. So it's really, there seems to be no differentiation between places with good, strong economies like Iowa and places like Georgia or Connecticut, where again, a blue state Democratic governor trouble because of the economy there is still seen as being
because it's resting on sentiment and not on sort of a
well, also, I think it's also
right.
just the fact that it's very uneven. I mean, some people that you talk to in Iowa, for example, say, yeah, my family is doing much better, but, I have these relatives who are still working in minimum wage jobs. And, so that's been interesting. The issue that really has receded is Obamacare, which is interesting because a couple of months ago, we would have thought that was all we were going to be talking about. I mean, barely anyone brings that up as the first issue anymore. And, it's actually kind of a trouble spot for Republicans when they talk about repealing it, because people are sort of like, well, what am I going to get instead?
Mm-hmm.
So,
and they haven't decided to put forward any sort of plan.
I mean, some of them have, but
right.
they're not speaking with one voice on that.
And for them, there's no percentage in it.
Right.
I mean, all they have to do is say, we're not Obama, isn't he terrible?
Right.
And that's working in a lot of places.
Lastly, Mark, the message that, as Maeve indicated, for Republicans, a lot of it has been pushed to the right because of the electorate this year. You've had Scott Brown talking about immigrants coming over the southern border and possibly bringing polio, and they've talked about ISIS. Different candidates have talked about ISIS militants coming over the border. There's been a real strong surge. How much in that kind of rhetoric, how much of their message this time is going to cause them problems in 2016 when you do have a different and much more varied electorate?
Well, it's going to be a problem is the very short answer, because as Maeve suggested, a midterm electorate is a very, very different one than a general election electorate. And, you need to look no further than the issue of immigration. America is changing politically, the map is changing politically, and a huge amount of that is driven by the Latino vote. Latinos, we saw it here in California, it's moved eastward from California, we've seen it in Nevada, we've seen it in Colorado, we're even seeing it in places like Georgia where you wouldn't expect to see it. And what Republicans have done in the main, we're generalizing here, in the main, they have taken a position that can be perceived as being, I don't want to say anti-immigrant, but it comes across that way to a lot of Latino voters. And they run the risk of alienating these voters who aren't crazy about President Obama either, but are sitting out this election, but they will remember in 2016. It's not like people automatically flip a switch and forget everything that's been set up to now. So the bottom line is good politics in a midterm election is not necessarily good term in a general election. And that's the problem Republicans face.
And many of the people who are elected this time out, at least in the Senate, will have to defend their seats in a presidential year, which could be interesting for them as well.
Right. And that's what we're seeing. A lot of the folks who are up this year were Democrats who swept in on the Obama wave, to use a word, and they're defending these seats now in an environment that's way less hospitable.
Yeah. We'll have, we'll have comprehensive coverage of the election from now until Wednesday at least. We'll be back here Wednesday for another conversation via video. Please check in with us at latimes.com/politics or on Twitter at LA Times Politics. Thank you.